Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, I will put in a poll for everyone while we're getting settled in. Um, and just, feel free to answer to your best guess. But it's exciting times. You can go to the next. Like this webinar will be recorded, and as we go through the data, feel free to post any questions that you might have. You should have a button in the toolbar in your Zoom to be able to submit questions. Go to the next one, Steve. So while we're letting more people in and getting settled in, uh, please answer our poll. So which generation is most likely to say that we're already in a recession? We'll give a few minutes just for some more people to trickle in, and then we'll take it away. Hope everyone's having a good Wednesday today. There we go, getting some answers in. A few people saying millennials, a few people saying Gen Z, a few people saying Gen X. Let's see the answer, Stephen. What's the answer to this question? So Gen Z, 75% of Gen Z say that we are already in a recession. That is followed by millennials at 66% and Gen X at 56%. Um, and basically the you guys are pretty spot on. Majority of you said Gen Z. So as we get started into extra program today, I'll just want to introduce a few faces and some of the people that will be talking this afternoon. So Mike Greenfield is our co-founder and our CEO. Uh, I'm Samadi Thomas. I'm one of the analysts here at Change Research, and the two that you'll be hearing from today are Melanie Phillips. She is the head of our analyst team, and Stephen Clermont. He is the head of polling, and he will be walking through the findings here. So a little bit rundown of the agenda today. We'll walk through kind of the macro numbers, those top line numbers, just really setting the scene of where we are historically as far as how voters feel about the economy. Um, who are these voters? So we'll talk through some of the segments of the electorate that we will discuss as we run through these findings. Economic pains. So what are voters feeling? What are they expecting when it comes to the economy, and how does that affect that political fallout when we get closer to November? And then lastly, we'll have some time at the end to answer some of your burning questions. With that, I'll hand it to Stephen.
Thank you, Samani, and thank you, Melanie, and all of you for joining us. I'm going to go through a poll that we did, one of our regular Compass polls that we do nationally every month. This one is of 2,244 registered voters in the United States, and we surveyed them a couple of weeks ago, from May 5th to 10th. Like all Change Research surveys, we do multimodal online surveying. So we recruit people online through social media ads and through SMS text messaging. And this is weighted to reflect sort of our understanding of what we think the registered voter universe is by age, gender, race and ethnicity, education, party, and region, urbanicity, a whole variety of variables. And our margin of error is 2.4%. And as you can see, 46% men, 52% women, 42% college graduates, 63% white, and about equal in party ID. Well, exactly equal in party ID, um, with 44 Democrats, 44 Republicans, and 12% independents. And sort of the goal I wanted to do with this survey is we're seeing a lot of data now, particularly like the New York Times data that came out on Monday, that's showing a very different electorate than the one that existed in 2024, with large declines in perceptions of the president among Hispanic voters, younger voters, sort of the 2024 coalition that people wrote books and everything about is not really durable. And my goal in this is to really sort of like go into the electorate. Who are the different groups of people? How movable are they? And there's a lot, sort of, there's like two different schools of commentary that I read. One of them, and particularly the one is like by the longtime analyst Charlie Cook, which is this is a very narrow playing field. The country's evenly divided. Elections are mostly decided at the margins. And there shouldn't be sort of big assumptions of big gains through one side or the other. Um, and then you look at data that like we're going to show here in the New York Times show that like Democrats leading by a large percentage. Um, and just the amount of instability that exists both in our economy and downstream from our politics is we're entering a new era. Um, at the beginning of the 21st century, one of George Bush's pollsters wrote in a memo to Karl Rove that sort of reported on famously that really, so they're sort of thinking there really aren't swing voters in the electorate anymore. Only about 7% are true independents and truly undecided. And the key to winning elections is like, exciting and turning out your base. But when we sort of look and go deep into these voters, um, that's not necessarily the case anymore, particularly with how they're perceiving the economy and how they're perceiving sort of where they are in their own lives. There's going to be much greater opportunity for volatility ahead. So one of the things I wanted to look at here is um, we get every month now new numbers from the University of Michigan and their Consumer Sentiment Index. And the most current reading, the early reading for May and the reading for April, is the lowest scores that have ever been that this this sort of metric has ever seen before. Lower than they were during the recession in the late 70s and early 80s when we had an Iranian conflict and high oil prices. Um, Lower than at any point during the Great Recession in 2008, lower than during COVID, and lower than sort of the depths of inflation under Biden in the last term. And what we're seeing now with Trump is lower than that. And this sort of debate of whether, well, was this measuring? Is it measuring the same thing as it did before? I think we just got to take this at face value is and listen to what the American people are telling us. And we sort of look at this. I went and mapped um, first term presidents and sort of what from inauguration day to midterm day, how they changed, how the consumer sentiment changed during that time period, and what that meant for the performance in the House. And Trump is unique because is he a first term president now? Because he wasn't president the previous 4 years, or is he in his second term? And like this degree of volatility is pretty common for first term presidents. George H.W. Bush saw a big drop in consumer confidence during his for the Iraq War. Um, George W. Bush saw a decline during his first term. Trump, when Democrats gained over 40 seats in the House in 2018, there's actually very little decline in consumer sentiment under Trump's first term, but we've seen a large drop in his second term, about on a par with what we saw under Joe Biden. But again, there wasn't quite the didn't correlate well with changes in House seats. But if you sort of view Trump as a second term president, the drop we've seen so far is historic. In most second term presidencies, like their years 5 and 6, consumer sentiment didn't really change that much. It went up under Barack Obama, and that didn't really prevent a big midterm wipeout for the Democrats in 2014. Um, all of these, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush saw big declines in Congress, both in the House and Senate, in their second terms, but the actual sentiment hadn't changed. So we're really, again, sort of you're going to hear me say a lot, really in uncharted territory. And a big part of that is the Trump economy in his second term is just different than it was during his first term. And what I measure here on this chart is we start at zero for at the beginning of each term, and then see the differences in inflation, which is the orange line, personal disposable income, which is the purple line, and then up through in the gray line, the stock market, which is not really tethered to any of these sort of core economic matrices. And the Trump first term, the reason why he was perceived as doing well on the economy and how his reflective job performance was so strong in 2024 was pre-COVID. Personal disposable income grew at a higher rate than inflation did. We had very low inflation, and really personal disposable income, after being held artificially low by austerity politics during the previous decade, really sort of were unleashed. And the thing about COVID that we forget and is not really commonly understood in sort of the economic retelling of the Trump first term is COVID happened, the stock market quickly reacted negatively, then was positive again. But the money that was shoveled out the door by the federal government and just people not spending because there was nothing to do went up substantially. So people during that time period actually felt much better. And then when you reset for the beginning of the Biden administration, it's big jump in disposable income through the American Rescue Act. And then immediately all of those things, like the money stopped coming from the federal government, all the temporary programs all expired, and then inflation went up through the supply chain disruptions. The impact, the economic impact was not really felt when Trump was president, but it was really felt under Biden. But looking now at Trump's second term, it's not the first term. This is new readings have not come out since the war/excursion in Iran began, but inflation has been outpacing growth in personal disposable income, and personal disposable income has largely stayed flat. And yet the stock market has done well after doing poorly, but not nearly the degree the jumps we saw in the first term. But you could sort of see, and I think unsaid in this, is that Trump's policies haven't changed. The Republican policies of tax cuts and deregulation cuts really had nothing to do with the dynamic that happened in the first term of income versus costs. And whatever sort of magic he had just doesn't apply now. And we're going to see sort of in people's attitudes what that actually means. And this is a chart we've been doing that every quarter we do a survey of middle income Americans and ask them, is their income going up faster than the cost of living, staying even, or falling behind? Pretty consistently, from about third quarter of 2023 till now, it's basically about two-thirds. And as you can see, like we've had now 5 readings of this since Trump has become president again, and this really hasn't changed. And this was a core promise of why he got elected. So the goal in the survey and the data I'm about to present to you is I've been working a lot, both with clients and overall, to sort of segment out the people who can be moved politically versus the people who can't. And had this metric called movable voters that I presented on a few months ago, based on our Compass polling. And that's people who are undecided in the race for US House, people who are unfavorable towards both parties, or people who somewhat disapprove of the job that Trump is doing. That's about 26% of the electorate. But when we're going to go through here, I'm going to sort of like look at other different groups. There's about 20% of people who rate their motivation to vote this year below a 10, a 0 to 9. So we want to sort of look at them because they're very different than the people who are very motivated to vote. The pure independents, the people who tell us that they're independent, and then when we push them to a party, they still say that they're independent. They really don't associate with a party. 18 to 34-year-olds, because they are, as we've seen, experiencing the economy and experience politics in a very different way than older voters had, especially since most of them have only really known in their adult lives Donald Trump as the leader and figure of the Republican Party. And then the 12% of voters who tell us that they did not vote in 2024. And there's some theorizing before the election that this group is even more Trumpier than the electorate overall. I don't think we really can know that because they ultimately didn't vote. But where they are now is very different than how they were perceived before 2024. So if you put all these groups together, we have about half of the electorate. And then about half of the electorate, I'm calling the brick wall. These are people who voted in 24. They're decided on who they're going to vote for US House. They rate their motivation to vote as a 10 out of 10. They're 35 or older, so sort of middle-aged millennials, older millennials, and then Gen X, boomers, silent generation. Um, Clear in their party identification, they identify as a Democrat or a Republican. They do not hate both parties. They have positive or neutral feelings towards at least one of them. And these voters, they tilt Republican 54-46. So if only they voted, Democrats would have a hard time winning. So we have to think about like what's going to move these other groups of movable voters. And as you can see, like by vote motivation, I think overall us similar to some other pollsters. I just saw one poll today by Hart Research. We have a 4-point Democratic edge in general in the generic House vote. So not as high as the New York Times, but like clear advantage. But with the people who rate their motivation as a 10, Democrats lead 50-43. That's what I'm seeing in a lot of private polling. The 10 motivation, the likely voters, the likeliest voters, um, skew Democratic a little bit more than the people who are less motivated to vote. As you can see, the less motivated, 36 Republican, 26 Democrat, 38% not sure. They're actually approve Trump less than the people with 10 motivation. And that's because among Republicans, 60% of them who rate their motivation as a 10 identify as part of the MAGA movement versus 34% of the less motivated voters. So the most motivated voters, the likeliest voters are people like they are definitely more Democratic, and the Republicans in them are more MAGA and more pro-Trump. And really, the question for the less motivated voters and whether they're going to vote or not is whether the sort of center right or right leaning people who don't identify with MAGA, much less enthusiastic by Trump, are they going to vote or not vote? And so when we look at these different groups, I'm going to split out the brick wall here by movable, the less motivated voter, the independent, the young voter, and the non-voter. As you can see, obviously, since we define brick wall as older voters, but the movables, the less motivated voter, the 2024 non-voter, skew significantly younger than the rest of the electorate, as do the pure independents. Um, they are each one of these sort of persuadable groups are fairly diverse, and they're a little bit less educated, both Democrats and Republicans, than the sort of brick wall, most motivated, unpersuadable voters. As you can see, the brick wall voters identify 9 points more with Democrats. The movable, largely these persuadable groups, they identify at least initially as independents. 62% of the movables do, 50% of the less motivated, 38% of younger voters, 58% of non-2024 voters, all initially identify as independents. And all of these groups, the movables, the less motivated, when you push them, the non-voters, they don't really identify, way less than a majority identify as Democrats. The only group that even gets to 50% are 18 to 34-year-old voters, and that's largely driven by women. Young men are largely dissatisfied with the status quo, but they don't identify as Democrats. And as you can see, the movables, um, large percentage of them did not vote. Slight Harris advantage here. The less motivated voters are voted by Trump by 15 points. The pure independents split. And the 18 to 34-year-olds say that they voted for Harris. And here's why all of this is important is because when we look at these measures of economic well-being, and particularly personally, the these groups, the movables, less motivated, independents, are significantly more likely than the decided partisans to say that their income is falling behind the cost of living. Only about a majority of the brick wall voters say their income is falling behind the cost of living in the last 6 months, but 70%, two-thirds to three-quarters of all these other groups say their income is falling behind the cost of living. Only about half of the brick wall partisans say that America is in a recession, while the persuadable voters, almost three-quarters of them, depending on the group, is America is currently in a recession, and a near majority of them definitely think that's the case. And that's sort of why I did this, is looking at these different groups and sort of realizing they all view the world roughly similarly. So if you're trying to message to young voters, you're also really messaging to the movable, the less motivated, the independent, the non-voters. It's their worldviews are all very similar. And I think we got to sort of assume from this, assume they're a much bigger part of the electorate, um, really focus on identifying them and working to persuade them, because this is, as we go through this, this is the election to do it. Um, Younger voters we asked people whose income is falling behind the cost of living how they're addressing that. Um, Everyone says that they're cutting back on non-essential purchases. Younger voters, particularly 18 to 34-year-olds, say they're cutting back or pausing saving for the future. It's not really something older voters are doing as much. Um, about equal shares of tapping savings. But young people are using credit cards more. They're asking for help from family or friends. They're trying to earn additional income through part-time work. Trying to find a higher paying job. And these voters, Gen Z is going to be an increasing share of the electorate. And what they're experiencing now is going to shape them into elections in the future. And that's how we need to start adjusting our messaging towards that. As you can see, half of the brick wall partisans say that they're not saving enough to retire comfortably. 35% of them say that they are. But all these other groups, hardly any of them say they're saving enough to retire comfortably. Two-thirds say that they're not. Um, Brick wall partisans are much more likely to have an expense emergency fund to cover $1,000 expense or more. Nearly half of everyone else does not. And this is a question I will shout out to my colleague, Gretchen Barton at Worthy Strategy. Wanted me to ask a question of people. Do they think, how close are you to where you thought you'd be at this stage of your life? And like 67% of 18 to 34-year-olds, 66% of less motivated voters, 69% of movables think that they are behind where they thought they'd be at this stage of their life. And more than 40% of them think that they're far behind them. Very few think they're on pace or ahead. And that's, I think when we're just sort of need to think bigger and need to think bigger about like the policies, messaging, and sort of what in America going forward is going to look like that's actually going to work for them, that they can believe. But part of that is just sort of acknowledging not only sort of the economic pain that they're experiencing, but the belief that they're not getting to where they want to be or where they thought they would be when they were growing up. And the economic assessments of pretty much everything by the persuadable voters are all fairly negative. They're fairly negative about the economic health of the country, their ability to save for the future, America's trade relations with other countries, the economic health of their community by large margins. People are assessing that as not so good or poor. Their personal finances, large majorities are rating them at the state of that as not so good or poor. Uh, Again, this shows how like the decided partisans are fundamentally different than everybody else. They're the ones most likely to have money in the stock market. They think the stock market's doing great. The half of the country that is movable do not. They think their personal finances are either excellent or good, more so than not so good or poor. And that is just living in a fundamental different reality than the half of the country that is not fixed politically. And also the persuadables, persuadable groups, all of them almost universally expect gas prices to keep going up. The brick wall voters, they also do too, but 29% of them expect that they're going to go down. So the less motivated Republicans are really not buying the happy talk they're getting from the White House. Um, 80% or more of these voters believe that the cost of food and groceries are going to go up, that two-thirds or more that the utilities are going to go up, and two-thirds or more that their health care is going to go up. So it's not only sort of negative on where things are, how it's keeping them from living the life that they believe that they want to live. They don't see this as getting better. Um, and when you have a president who's at 37%, you have $5 gallon of gas, we're going to start seeing more and more polling results that might not match expectations of elections in 2022 or 2024, um, but are reflective of where people think things are, which is not good. So this is where we get to the fallout from this. Brick wall voters, half of them think a year from now the economy will be better. 46% of them think it'll be worse. By and large, all of these persuadable groups, these independents, movables, young voters, two-thirds or more believe that the US economy will be worse. Um, Brick wall voters think that their personal finances more of them think it'll be better than worse. With the exception of 18 to 34-year-olds, who are probably the persuadable group, like the most optimistic, all of them think their personal finances will be worse. And largely, two-thirds or more believe that the price of everyday goods, that it will be worse, they will be higher. There's very little positive thinking about the voters who are up for grabs that things are going to get better. So I mean, so again, the challenges for Democrats are naming the villains, um, understanding what's facing them, and then preparing to offer a different vision for the future um, that explicitly contrasts against the failures of Trump and the Republicans. I mean, know that there was some from reading a thing last week by Kamala Harris's digital director about sort of the abandoning of Project 2025 during the campaign. We've seen what Project 2025 is, and we can run not against Trump as the person, but as the corrupt president whose agenda is not working. And we can explicitly contrast from that. As you can see with the movable voters, the less motivated voters, the pure independents, young voters, and the 2024 non-voters largely view Trump negatively and that this project has been a failure. 73% of movable voters unfavorable towards him. JD Vance doesn't do much better. Um, all largely like numbers with independents that have never been seen before for a sitting administration. Certainly not something that were ever really achieved by Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and certainly I don't think Biden ever got this low. Young voters and young men, the sort of podcasting young men who were credited for helping Trump in the last election, largely negative towards him and JD. And the 2024 non-voters, which some people claimed all throughout the election and since then that were more right-leaning, um, have turned against this administration. The brick wall, which again reflects an 8-point Republican advantage. People, the election is only going to, if the only people are going to vote are the people that we know are clear partisans, we're going to lose that election. The key is turnout and winning over these voters, particularly contrasting against the present that they currently are experiencing and don't like. Um, the challenge here, obviously, is that the Democratic Party is not viewed positively either. And given the fact Democrats don't have control of Washington, D.C., that's going to be hard to change. But this is something that individual candidates, particularly challengers and people in open seats, can use to their advantage of running against Washington, running against corruption, and then contrasting wanting to achieve their values that people don't necessarily believe or see coming from the Democratic Party. And I think with all of these groups, with the exception of the less motivated voter, they're all fairly negative towards the Republican Party too. So this is the challenge, but we have the reality that people are experiencing to run and contrast against. And then if and when we win these elections, assuming that they're held fairly, it's a topic for a different webinar, that have the opportunity to deliver and communicate in a different way. But this is the larger challenge. And Trump's approval on issues, sort of when you look at the brick wall voter, see positively on border control, conflict with Iran, on +4 on the economy, -2 on healthcare, -5 on inflation, the cost of living. But all these other groups give him very, very negative ratings. With the movable voters, which is again 26% of the electorate, these are people who will consider voting for Democrats. -52 on the conflict of Iran, -56 on the economy, -65 on inflation, the cost of living. Independent voters, 50 points or more negative on the economy, Iran, healthcare, and inflation. Same thing with young voters, and especially the same thing with 2024 non-voters. When we look at the House vote, so you can see Democrats, with the exception of young voters, Democrats are below 50%. But Republicans are even lower. They win only 18% of movable voters. This, how we define this in 2024, Trump did much better with this group. They're largely undecided, which again is the need for strong persuasion this election. Republicans only get 14% of independents, so trailing by 17. Only 29% of voters under the age of 35, and only 25% of people who didn't vote in 2024. Democrats are getting 37 of movables, 26% of less motivated, 31% of independents, 38% of non-voters. But with all of these groups, Trump is at 70%, two-thirds to three-quarters disapprove. And it's hard to see how that is going to change. Um, he's not going to get the ballroom built by November, and everyone see how amazing the ballroom is. That seems to be the core of his agenda right now. But there's nothing else that's really going to sort of drive this. And again, this is chart better meant to read, but this is again like, not to be Pollyannish about the challenges Democrats face. With the brick wall voters, Democrats have an edge over Republicans on trust on healthcare, and really it's about equal on housing affordability, um, and basically trailing Republicans on all of these issues. But Republicans, among everybody else, the half of voters who are young or persuadables, Republicans really don't have an edge on much of anything. I think the closest they have is immigration, 38 to 31, national security, 35-32, crime and public safety, 37 to 30. But Democrats have edge on education, on healthcare, on protecting freedoms, 8 points on the economy, 16 points on housing affordability, 12 points on inflation. All these numbers that can be improved by Democrats, and especially by Democrats in individual races, running strong campaigns against the Trump Republicans. Um, but there's a large group, a third or more of these persuadables who don't trust either party. So again, it's like we have a challenge in this cycle. We're gonna have a challenge in 28 and 2030. But like this experience with Trump is making groups of voters, sort of like the decided voters that Matthew Dowd was writing about 25 years ago, more open to voting differently because of what they are experiencing. And sort of the most important issue overall with everybody, and there's no difference in brick wall and movables and less motivated on government corruption. People say that that is the number one issue for them. Pure independence, 56%. This is consistent with research that we've done with End Citizens United, where corruption is the number one issue, and it's the number one issue with every party. And that was even before the 1.776 billion slush fund for January 6ers, through the president's insider trading on stocks of companies he visits and promotes on his social media, and all the other things. The three more things will come out before the end of this week. With the brick wall voters, immigration and border security is the next top issue, and then ensuring election integrity. With all the other voters, the movables, the less motivated, young voters. It's really corruption and costs, corruption and inflation. Corruption and costs are really what the story of this election is going to be about, um, and much more so than what where the partisans are. And we also asked when the issues that people didn't select as most important, what are the least important issues? The number one issue that overall was climate change, which again, we're sort of in the midst of an affordability crisis. That makes it a little more challenging, but that's driven largely through brick wall votes. And the number two issue, or number one issue with a lot of these persuadable groups is fighting back against wokeness and DEI. People don't think that that's important. And I saw some comments by the White House political director, James Blair, who just went to um, the MAGA super PACs, basically saying that they're going to run the some version of Kamala Harris is for they them, Donald Trump is for you. But as we saw in Virginia last year, and what how people are experiencing this economy is going to be sort of less impactful. I just want to wrap up with I think the thing that we're going to see a lot in the next 5.5 months is a lot of different polling results that are going to be, particularly when you look at the people that are most motivated to vote, definite voters, likeliest voters, that are going to be more positive than for Democrats other than we've seen in what we've gotten to used to expect in other campaigns. And I think when we look back on Virginia, we look back on our voter modeling for Virginia and New Jersey in 2021, those electorates shifted about 12 points overall. About two-thirds of that was for vote shifting, and about a third was turnout changes. Most of that was reversed. We're sort of comparing from 2024 to 2025. Mikey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger did about 8 to 9 points better than Kamala Harris did in those states. And that was largely vote switching. Now, a state like Florida went from 20 to 22, went 16 points in the Republican direction, from Donald Trump to Ron DeSantis. About 10 points of that was a result of vote switching, Biden to DeSantis voters, and the rest of it was more Republicans voting than Democrats. In a lot of these states that like different prognosticators have said, like taken off the map. We're This is not the year to do it. Just from what we've seen with these persuadable voters, the decline that Trump has had in each one of these states by 15, 20 points or more since the beginning of the second term. And then when you look at vote motivation, we're going to see Democrats ahead in places that they haven't really been able to compete in for several years. And I think rather than immediately dismissing stuff like that, it's to understand where voters are, particularly the deep frustration on costs and corruption in a lot of cases. The fact that in open seat races, there's no real popular incumbent running, that we're going to see a lot more competitive races. And I think the goal for this year is to campaign and be in as many places as we possibly can. Not assume based on past metrics, oh, this is impossible. Voters are open to hearing from Democrats in different ways than they haven't before. So this is be as maximalist as we possibly can, compete in as many places as we can, have different types of candidates saying this different things as opposed to what the MAGA Republicans are nominating, which is basically like MAGA GPT candidates that just say something um, based on what's said coming in from the White House. And that is really to start not be as constrained of thinking about things in the past, but the type of future that we want to get to and start communicating with voters that we haven't for a while and really, really hammer home the frustrations with the existing status quo.
Stephen, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have a thought that I was thinking about during this presentation. Do you think there's a world in which people can campaign that this Trump administration is not who Trump was and he is no longer like holding true to the Trump of the first administration? Because like you said, this is pretty much like a whole new term in a first term
Yeah.
presidency.
Um, I think that's something worth testing. I think that's add ideas from the next Compass poll, Melanie. I think that's something worth testing. I know that some people are going to like that would sort of set them on edge because it's acknowledging like what we were trying to deny and campaign against in 2024. But I think it's something worth, it's something that should be saying, and more people should be saying that this is an old, like, this is an old, tired man who, like, you look at some videos from the 2016 campaign, it's a very different person than what we see now. Um, and I've never seen or read stories about how a lame duck 6-year administration is like basically the entire party's agenda is this guy is great, and that's what we're going to run primaries on. And pledging fealty to a lame duck is strange to me. But just because we haven't seen it, I think it's just like because of that, I think we got to experiment more and then really just run like even sort of like to the people that really haven't voted for Democrats or have liked Trump, it's not like make them feel guilty for not voting for Kamala Harris, although they should be. It is that just like, what we saw the first term, this is a different guy. And that it's kind of weird that like no one else has a spine or a backbone or really or any idea. Um, it's like I don't watching the video of JD Vance yesterday was interesting because he was at his most obnoxious, and I just don't see how that's going to appeal to people in the same way that Trump did.
We have a few questions. One is from Chris Co. Were there any questions that asked who people blamed for the poor economy? Did we ask specifically if they blamed Trump or Biden or Republicans or Democrats?
Um, we didn't in the survey, but we've had asked that, and we've had asked like who do you blame, like are things going well or not so well, and who do you blame for the high cost of living? It is more. It is definitely growing more that people blame current policies in Washington, D.C. And when we've asked specifically, is like Trump or Biden, we get more people blaming Trump. Um, we haven't asked it yet specifically on gas prices yet, but I've seen in other data that it's pretty clear that people blame Trump for gas prices. And given the fact that the Republican talking point is just like, well, gas prices were higher under Biden, um, it's like that's the best they can do. That's not really a structural reason why gas is expensive now. I think that's the hardest part that they're facing, as well as the president saying, "I don't care about people's personal finances at all." I think it's important to clean out the helicopter noise from that video and then just sending it over and over and over again. But it is. I do remember that in 2010, I think almost until the 2010 election, when people said the economy was bad, more people blamed the Bush administration than the Obama administration. But the, the closer we got to the election, the more it was placed on Obama. And it's the same trajectory here, although that's like Democrats are going to consistently blame Trump the most. Trump and then price gouging from corporations is also what people blame.
We have another question from Colin. He asks, any research on how the electorate has changed in perception of the Israel Gaza, war and conflict going on there? Have you seen any research on how that's affected people's perceptions?
I think in our last poll, and I think we can send a link to it. We asked in the last Compass poll about opinions about different world leaders and compared it to when I asked this for in a different survey, client survey in 2023, so about 2 months before October 7th. And the numbers for Bibi Netanyahu have gotten, I think, unsurprisingly, much, much worse. And we identified Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and much, much worse with Democrats and independents. And I think went like 52% favorable with Republicans to 48%. But I think consistent that finding and consistent with the favorability that the Pew Research Center just did on Israel, particularly with Democratic voters, it is I think it is more challenging for um, supporters of the current Israeli government to make that case, but that those numbers have gotten, I mean, like almost universal. Like Bibi is at Putin, basically Putin levels with Democrats, and that is a significant change from August of 2023.
One other question comes in, it kind of more around just how we got this information, but the household incomes that you spoke about, were those household incomes or were they individual incomes?
Household incomes.
One thing,
Um,
sorry, one thing, Stephen, while I was thinking about this, and I think we have one more slide, um, is how much of brick wall voters are also less vulnerable voters? Because thinking about that question you had on they have $1,000 in savings. Like brick wall voters are much higher on that. And so how much is like being brick wall is almost like a privilege in the sense that
Yes.
you're able to stay in this like partisan lane and not have to deal with any switching because you're less vulnerable.
I think that's a I think that's a big reason why. I mean, as we saw, it's like this group is also much more educated, and I think it's you have the privilege to be much more consistent if you're not when you're not suffering the same degree of want as other people are who have less job security, less food security, less housing security.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess my question for you, Stephen, is do we feel like, hey, these brick wall voters aren't experiencing this personally, but do we have any sense that understand that there are, their neighbors or other people in the country that are really facing and living these tougher realities, and if that's in any way swaying how they might think when they're thinking about who to support?
Um, I think how they would, again, I don't have data to prove this, but my instinct would say that they are filtering the information they get about what other people are experiencing and using it to further reinforce their own political worldview. Um, they're not seeking to like more information that I don't think they're necessarily susceptible to things that would change their worldview. And what they're seeing in the experience of others is further reinforcing it. And like they will like if a neighbor is struggling or going through some horrible thing or like bankrupted because of medical debt, then they are blaming the political party that they are opposed to for that. It's not necessarily going through sort of a multi-layered, thoughtful exercise and who is truly responsible for medical debt. But
Um,
these voters also like the I don't have a slide here, but also by like 20-point margins, follow the news more closely, more likely to read newspapers, watch television news. The media consumption of that is also different. These movables, less motivated, pure independent, much more likely to get like random bits of information online through YouTube, which similar to foundings that you presented on a few months ago, Samadi, and brick wall voters, more engaged with news and then using that to filter their own views of reality that fit within that.
Yes, kind of a closing. If you can sum up, Stephen, and jump in, Melanie. Uh, you know, what would you say is your largest takeaway from this data? Like, what is something that's the most actionable information we can use from this data, especially like looking towards elections this November?
It's compete in more places that there are the pool of persuadable voters or people who are movable is bigger than what we think they are. And the anger towards the status quo is fairly great and growing. Um, as the if sort of see as the electorate is going to change, as there are fewer baby boomers and Gen Xers and more millennials and Gen Z and then Gen Alpha entering the electorate, um, we're I've like to think that we're sort of at an end of a political era, and we don't sort of know when it's going to end and how it's going to end. But just sort of looking at this, it's just like we're closer than we think, and we're gonna like we have to be prepared to be much more aggressive in communicating about um, the world that we're going to be, the political and economic world we want to move to, um, and and focus less on past models and past or things that are better in the past, and really be much more focused on where we want to be and how we get there. How about you, Melanie?
I think to me, it suggests that we need to, like, I appreciate the way you removed the voters that we might not think of as being together, like solid Dems and solid Republicans are actually similar in a way that makes it clearer what the middle ground really is and what the general is. I want to keep looking across, like, what we're calling brick wall voters as essentially a smaller portion of the selectorate or the electorate than we thought originally. I also think that this idea of vulnerability is sticking in my head, and voters are going to be pushed again to the edge of this vulnerability, and highlighting that there's no reason we should have a population this vulnerable. With the economic numbers you presented at the beginning, it doesn't look like there's going to be much foundation for growth before the midterms.
Thank you. So before we close out, just a little bit about Change Research and who we are. We were founded in 2017 to democratize access to public opinion research. Along with doing custom polling and supporting our clients across the country, we also have a few other offerings. Much of the data that you heard about today comes from our monthly Compass polls that feed into the Change Research data portal. You can find a link in the chat if you are interested in signing up for free today and accessing some of the information. Um, but beyond that, I hope that everyone has a great rest of your week. Thank you so much for joining us for the last hour or so. Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks so much, all. This was great.